somewhere along the bayous of Louisiana, in a parish whose exact location has been carefully blurred by time and design. There is said to be a story that should not have survived. The land is gone now, the buildings burned, the records scattered or destroyed. And yet, in court notes, private letters, and the stubborn memory of people who refuse to forget, a single incident keeps resurfacing, an incident that calls into question everything we think we know about survival. Power and the fragile border between human and animal. According to an 1847 court record, the event involved 8 hunting dogs, a locked cellar beneath their kennels, and a young enslaved woman who was meant to die in the dark. Instead, she emerged 72 hours later, changed, no longer a victim, but a figure one magistrate described only as possessing an authority I cannot explain and dare not question. Within a week, the plantation where this took place was reduced to ash. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, no one believed that. 3 letters from neighboring estate owners, now kept in a private collection in Baton Rouge, describe what none of them could understand. They all claimed to have seen the same impossible sight. A girl of no more than 19 years, walking calmly through the main gates at dawn with 8 massive hunting dogs at her back. The animals moved in perfect formation, their eyes fixed on her as if she were not their prey, not even their handler, but their commanding officer. That same morning, the mistress of the plantation, a baroness by title and temperament, was found dead in her chambers. The cause, in the parish record, is simple and bland: heart failure. The truth, as always, is more complicated to understand what happened in that cellar, and why so many people later tried to erase it. We have to begin long before the dogs descended the ladder. The story starts not with the girl, but with the land, and with the woman who came to claim it. In the 1840s, St. Landry Parish lay like a stitched quilt across Louisiana sugar country, a patchwork of old French families and new American money. Cypress swamps melted into endless rows of sugar cane, and the air was so heavy with heat and moisture that wool suits clung to men's backs and tempers frayed as quickly as thread. This was Acadian country, where French was still the language of power and pride, where Catholic saints stared down from mantelpieces, and where the arithmetic of slavery and profit was accepted by those who benefited from it. As the natural order of the world, the town of Opelousas served as the parish seat. A modest cluster of buildings gathered around a central square. The courthouse loomed there, its columns already cracking despite having been built less than 2 decades earlier. On Saturdays, the square swelled with life. Planters' wives picked over bolts of fabric brought in from New Orleans, calculating which patterns would elevate or embarrass them at the next social gathering. Enslaved men and women moved quickly between errands under the hard eyes of overseers, never quite allowed to forget that they were being watched. Now and then, a traveling preacher claimed a corner and shouted warnings of divine judgment into the humid air. Though judgment, when it came in that parish, rarely descended from the heavens, real power did not live in Opelousas. It lived along the back roads and bayous in the sprawling estates that spread across the countryside, like small kingdoms. Each plantation was its own self-contained world, ruled absolutely by whoever held its deed. The Devo estate was one of these kingdoms. It's at about 7 miles northwest of town, reachable only by a shell road that turned into muck and misery every time the rain came heavy. The land had once belonged to the Fontenot family, French Creoles who had built their fortune on careful marriages and merciless efficiency. When the last Fontenot heir died childless in 1843, the estate passed through a tangle of legal maneuvers and debts until it landed in the hands of a woman no one in St. Landry had ever met, Baroness Eloise. Devo arrived in Louisiana in April of 1844. She came from Charleston, trailing roomers and servants in equal measure. Her luggage included trunks of European furniture, fine fabrics, and a reputation thoroughly unpacked before she ever stepped off the coach. She was the widow of a minor Belgian nobleman whose death, it was said in certain circles, had been financially convenient for her. In a world where gossip was a social currency, This detail alone ensured that her name was on many tongues before she spoke a word. She appeared to be around 40. Though she dressed as if determined to, with the calendar favoring rich fabrics, bold colors, and cuts that drew attention. Her beauty was the kind that had once been effortless, but now required maintenance and resented reminders of age. Yet it was not her face people remembered. It was her eyes. They held a cold, measuring look, the gaze of someone who did not simply see a room, but appraised it, the furniture, the silver, the people, all quietly converted to numbers in her mind. She spoke French fluently, though with an accent that betrayed years spent away from Louisiana. Her English was crisp and careful. Of the local Creole dialect, she made it clear she had no interest. It was beneath her station, she said, a language for those who had to live here, not for those who chose to own it within weeks of arriving. She made changes that sent small ripples of unease through the parish. She dismissed half the estate's workers. She replaced the Fontenot overseer with a man named Gaspard Thibault, whose reputation had beaten him to St. Landry as well. Thibault had been fired from 3 previous posts for what was politely described as excessive cruelty. The Baroness saw this as a recommendation, not a warning. Under direction, discipline on the estate tightened to a level that made neighboring planters hardly gentle. Men themselves exchanged uneasy glances over brandy and cigars, along with her furniture and servants. The Baroness brought 8 enormous hunting dogs from Charleston, beasts bred from mastiffs and bloodhounds until they were nearly 3 feet high at the shoulder. She spoke of them often, and always with pride. They were not pets, she told her dinner guests, but tools, dogs of intimidation, trained by a specialist in South Carolina. Their purpose was not companionship, but control. They were kept hungry, kept sharp, their every instinct shaped to dominate and terrify. Behind the main house, she had a special kennel built for them, a long, low wooden structure, sturdier than it first appeared. The dogs were fed on a strict schedule calculated to leave them always on the edge of hunger, always alert, always dangerous. She named each one after a European noble house: Bourbon, Savoy, Habsburg, Hohen, Slurlern, Romanov, Windsor, Grimaldi, and Medici. The joke, she said, delighted her. Ancient bloodlines reduced to obedient muscle at her command. They obeyed only her. She spoke to them in sharp, clipped German, and the animals responded instantly. To everyone else, even to Thibault, they offered only a flash of teeth and a low, promising growl. By the autumn of 1844, the Baroness had made herself known. People in St. Landry had settled on their opinions of her: impressed, wary, admiring, or disgusted, depending on whom you asked. On the Devo estate itself, no opinions were needed. The enslaved people there understood quickly that a new order had come, and it was crueler than the last. That same autumn, the Baroness traveled to New Orleans and purchased a girl at the slave market. The sale is still traceable in an old ledger. Female, estimated 16 years from Virginia estate sale. No name. Just an age, a place, and a note scribbled in the margin, uncommonly defiant for her age. Previous owner reports incidents of disobedience. Reduced price reflects difficult temperament. The Baroness bought her for $400, a discount, but still a considerable sum. The girl was brought to St. Landry in chains. On the plantation, the Baroness gave her a new name, Margarite. It was not the name the girl had been born with, not the name her mother had whispered over her. It was chosen because it sounded civilized, because it fit neatly on the Baroness's tongue, because the girl's real identity mattered to no one who thought of her as property. Margarite stood about 5'4". Her frame slim in the way that comes from growing up on too little food. Her hands bore the thickened skin of field work, but her previous owner's notes suggested she had been in training as a house servant before some unnamed incident made her more trouble than she was worth. What truly set her apart, though what had caused trouble in Virginia and would cause much more in Louisiana, was her gaze. Her eyes did not drop when white people spoke to her. They did not hold the performative fear that planters expected and demanded. They watched. They measured. They gave the disquieting impression that she was thinking, judging, remembering. The Baroness noticed this on the very first day. Here, she thought, was something to break. Margarite was assigned to the main house, cleaning rooms, serving meals, being constantly within the Baroness's line of sight. For weeks, Eloise Devo watched her, waiting for the slight mistakes, the tiny missteps that could justify punishment. When they did not come quickly enough, she created them. The first real opportunity arrived in late November. Margarite failed to curtsy quickly enough after being given an order. It was a small thing, but that was the point. The punishment was public. 20 lashes in the yard, delivered by Devo while the household staff was forced to watch. Margarite said nothing. She turned her face away and clenched her jaw so hard she bit the inside of her cheek, and a thin line of blood formed at the corner of her mouth. She did not scream. She did not beg. She endured. That silence enraged the Baroness far more than any shouted defiance might have. Over the months that followed, a cruel rhythm formed. The Baroness assigned tasks that could not be completed, then punished Margarite for failing. She planted items in the girls' quarters, then accused her of theft. She changed instructions and then raged when they were not followed. Other enslaved people learned quickly to keep their distance from Margarite. Being near the focus of the Baroness's obsession meant danger. Devo made jokes about how long the girl would last, whether her spirit or her body would break first. The joke, like everything else on the estate, was edged with threat. But Margarite did not break. She bent, she endured, she adjusted. But somewhere inside her, something remained whole. The Baroness saw in those unflinching eyes that small, stubborn core that refused to collapse, and what began as amusement curdled into obsession. That obsession, sharpened by humiliation and fear of losing control, would eventually lead to the cellar beneath the kennels, to 8 starving dogs, and to a test of will no one involved was meant to survive. And that is where the true story of the Devo estate begins. In March of 1845. A man arrived at the Devo estate whom no one had been told to expect. He came from Charleston and introduced himself as the Baroness's husband from an earlier marriage, a detail Eloise Devo had never once mentioned in St. Landry for 2 weeks. His presence changed the weather inside the main house. The Baroness, usually sharp and watchful, softened at the edges. She laughed at dinner, paid little attention to the servants, and seemed almost light-hearted. Margarite moved through those days like a shadow, barely noticed. The household whispered that perhaps the Baroness would return to Charleston with him, that the estate might be sold, that a less cruel owner might one day sit at the head of the table. Then, as suddenly as he'd come, the man left. The carriage rolled away down the shell road, and with it went the last hint of warmth around Eloise Devo. When she turned from waving him off, something in her expression had hardened into stone. Whatever comfort or distraction he'd provided had not softened her, but sharpened her. Gaspar Devo, who kept a meticulous journal of the estate matters, later wrote that April 1845 marked a change. The Baroness, he noted, became concerned less with the profitable running of the plantation and more with the refinement of control. She began spending long hours in the kennel building. Servants would see her through the slats, boots in the straw, dress hem stained, hands on the huge dog skulls as she drilled them through new commands. She reduced their feedings further, keeping them always on the trembling edge of starvation. Their ribs began to show beneath their coats, and their eyes took on a restless, feverish shine. Not long after, she ordered the construction of a cellar beneath the kennels. Devo oversaw the work. Laborers dug down into the earth behind the building, carving out a square pit roughly 8 feet on each side. Cypress boards were fitted tight along the walls. The floor was packed dirt, tamped hard under bare feet. Above, in the kennel's planked floor, a heavy trapdoor was set and secured with an iron padlock. There were no windows, no side entrance, no chimney, just a ladder that led down into darkness that no one was told the purpose of the room. No explanation was offered. But the men who dug it exchanged glances and did not ask questions. On plantations, some spaces existed only because someone with power imagined a use for them. That was enough. For a while, Margarite's life continued in a cruel, familiar pattern. She rose before dawn, emptied chamber pots, laid fires, polished silver, served meals. The Baroness, now absorbed by her dogs and whatever private calculations occupied her mind, seemed to have lost interest in her favorite target. The other enslaved workers relaxed around Margarite just slightly. Without the Baroness's constant gaze, she became less dangerous to stand near. Margarite herself showed no visible relief. She kept moving, kept working, kept surviving. If she felt anything about the shift in attention, she did not show it. Then came the incident with the bracelet. On May 17th, 1847, the morning broke thick and gray, the air heavy enough to feel like wet cloth against the skin. Margarite began her routine as always, moving through the quiet house while the White family still slept. She emptied basins, straightened rooms, lit fires, and finally carried a tray of tarnished silverware to the dining room to be polished. Before breakfast she stood over the sideboard, cloth in hand, when she heard the Baroness's bedroom door open upstairs. That alone was unusual. Eloise rarely emerged before 9. The footsteps that followed were quick and hard, descending the stairs with a purpose that made Margarite's shoulders tense before she ever saw her. The Baroness appeared in the doorway still in her dressing gown, hair unpinned, face twisted into the expression Margarite had learned to read as danger. "Where is it?" she asked, her voice quiet and controlled in a way that was more frightening than any shout. Margarite set down the spoon in her hand and turned, eyes dropping to the floor as she'd been trained. "Ma'am?" "My bracelet. The gold bracelet with sapphires. It was on my nightstand last night. This morning it is gone." She stepped into the room and began to circle Margarite slowly. "You were in my chambers yesterday, changing the linens." "Yes, ma'am. I saw it there." "Did you?" "I did not see any bracelet, ma'am." The Baroness's jaw clenched. "You did not see it, or you saw it and took it?" "I didn't take anything." The slap came faster than thought. The Baroness's hand cracked across Margarite's mouth, splitting her lip open on her teeth. "Empty your pockets." Margarite obeyed, turning out her apron. "A rag, a scrap of soap. Nothing more. Your quarters, then," the Baroness said. "We'll search your quarters." The search took only minutes. The small room Margarite shared with 2 other house servants held almost nothing pallets on the floor. A few pieces of clothing, a tin cup, a threadbare blanket. No bracelet in the doorway. Eloise Devo stood statue still, her face whitening with fury. "Tybo!" Her voice snapped through the house like a whip. The overseer appeared quickly, riding crop already in hand. "Take her to the yard," the Baroness said. 20 lashes for theft. "Ma'am, I didn't." The second slap was harder than the first. "Do not speak." The Baroness's eyes glittered with something sharp and bright. She paused, then smiled, a slow, thoughtful smile that made even Thibault's fingers tighten around the crop. "No," she said softly. "No, lashings are too simple." Her gaze shifted, as if some new idea had just slid into place. "Thibault, take her to the cellars." "The room beneath the kennels." Thibault's eyebrows twitched. "The room under the dogs, ma'am?" "Yes, lock her there." "For how long?" The Baroness's smile widened. "Until I decide she's learned proper respect. A day, perhaps 2. Let her sit in the dark and listen to the dogs above her. Let her think about what happens to thieves on my land. Should I bring her food?" "No food. Water twice a day." "I want her hungry when I let her out. I want her to understand what deprivation feels like." Thibault nodded and took Margarite by the arm. He did not drag her. He didn't need to. She walked out. The kennel building smelled of straw, old wood, and the hot, sour reek of dogs. As soon as the door opened, the animals erupted into a frenzy of barks and snarls, hurling themselves against the gates of their runs at the far end of the building. Thibault stopped at the trapdoor in the floor. He knelt, worked the iron lock open, and lifted the door. A wooden ladder vanished down into blackness. A cool, damp smell rose up from below earth, old wood, and something faintly animal. Down you go, he said. Margarite climbed down without argument. The ladder creaked under her weight. When she reached the dirt floor, she turned and looked out. Tyvo's face was just a dark shape against the rectangle of light. Then the trapdoor slammed shut, and the iron lock snapped back into place above her. The barking slowly faded to occasional growls and snuffles. Below, there was only silence as her eyes adjusted. The shape of the cellar emerged from the dark. 4 close wooden walls. An 8-foot square of packed earth. A low ceiling of planks with thin seams of light squeezing through. A wooden bucket stood in one corner. There was no bed, no chair, no blanket. Just the ground in the dark and the steady rasp of her own breathing. Margarite slid down with her back against the wall, pulled her knees to her chest, and pressed her lips together until the bleeding stopped. She could hear the dog above claws clicking on the boards, heavy bodies shifting, the huff of their breathing. Every so often, one barked and the sound shook the air around her. She had known worse confinement. In Virginia, after an argument with the overseer's wife, she had been locked for 3 days in a smokehouse during summer, breathing cured meat and her own panic. This cellar was bigger than that space, and it was not yet summer. A day or two, she told herself, the Baroness would tire of the game and call her back to work. Work had value, even when you were property. A slave sitting idle in the dark was a waste of money. What Margarite could not know was that the Baroness had no intention of letting her out in a day or two. The first day passed in a blur of discomfort. Devo came at what she guessed was dawn and dusk, lowering a tin cup of water on a rope through a crack in the trapdoor. He said nothing. When she finished, he hauled the cup back up and relocked the door. The dogs eventually grew used to the presence below. Their barking faded to the low sounds of beasts resting and waiting. Hunger arrived on the second day. Not the familiar dull ache of too few rations, but a sharp, twisting emptiness that clawed at her stomach and made her limbs feel hollow. The darkness thickened, pressing closer. Time unspooled, then nodded, then dissolved entirely. She counted water deliveries to build a fragile sense of the hours. On what she thought was the beginning of the third day, Devo did not come. No rope. Her throat dried until her tongue felt like leather. The pain in her belly became a blazing center around which all other thoughts circled and died. Somewhere above, the dogs shifted and whined restless. They were hungry too. Night fell, though in the cellar the only sign of it was a cooling of the air and away the faint light. Between the floorboards faded to nothing. Margarite lay on her side, too weak to sit up, when she heard a different set of footsteps above, lighter, quicker, and followed by the whisper of a dress. The Baroness? Are you thirsty, Margarite? Her voice slid through the cracks in the boards, sugar-sweet and cruel. Are you hungry? Margarite swallowed and tasted only dust. She did not answer. I imagine you are. I imagine you're thinking very hard about that bracelet you say you did not take. A pause, then a soft, amused laugh. Interesting thing, though. I found it this morning. It had rolled behind my dressing table. You were innocent all along. In the dark, Margarite closed her eyes. But you're still down there, aren't you? The Baroness went on. Because this was never about the bracelet. It's about that look in your eyes. That spark you think I don't see. I'm going to put it out. Footsteps creaked slowly from one end of the kennel to the other, directly over where Margarite lay. I've decided on a little experiment, Eloise Devo said. A test of nature. The dogs above you haven't been fed in 3 days. They're hungry, desperately hungry. You know what hungry dogs can do. Margarite could hear them now shifting, whining, the scrape of claws on wood. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to open that trapdoor and let them down, the Baroness continued. All 8 of them, starving, trained to dominate. And they will find you in that little room with nowhere to run. Nature will take its course. The strong will devour the weak. There is a certain poetry to that, don't you think? Margarite's heart thudded so hard she could feel it in her throat. 8 starving dogs in that tiny space. No weapon, no way out. Of course, the Baroness added lightly, you can still save yourself. You can scream. You can beg. You can swear to me that you are broken, that whatever you've been holding inside is gone. You have until dawn to decide. After that, the choice won't be yours anymore. A door creaked. Footsteps receded. One by one, the dogs settled back into a restless stillness. In the black silence of the cellar, Margarite lay on the packed earth and asked herself a question that no one ever expected a slave to be allowed to answer. How do you survive when you have been deliberately placed in a situation designed to kill you? Run? There was nowhere to run. Fight? Against 8 half-starved beasts with bare hands and no strength left. Beg? Even if the Baroness relented now, the price would be the one thing Margarite had refused to give since Virginia, herself. Her mind began to turn slow but steady over everything she had watched and learned since arriving at the Devo estate. The dogs were not pets. They were instruments. Their lives had been shaped around one idea: power. They understood dominance and submission, hierarchy and fear. They read bodies, postures, voices. They responded to strength, fled, or bit at weakness. But they were also hungry, starving like her, trapped like her, used like her. What if the Baroness was wrong about what nature demanded? What if hunger could be turned not into violence, but into something else? What if the same stubborn core the Baroness had tried so hard to crush, the thing that refused to bow, could reach across the invisible line between human and animal and build, in the darkest possible place, a new kind of bond? Margarite pushed herself upright with shaking arms. Her fingers dug into the packed earth in one corner, clawing at it until her nails split. If she was going to die, she decided it would not be as prey. It would be as something the Baroness had never believed she could be: an equal, a challenger, a creature the dogs might choose to follow instead of devour. Dawn crept slowly across the Devo estate, its pale light sliding through the cracks in the kennel's wooden walls. But in the cellar below, Margarite saw none of it. She only felt a faint change in temperature, the moment. When night loosened its grip and morning pressed down through the boards above, she had not slept. She had spent the long, suffocating hours listening to the dogs shift restlessly, their claws ticking across the wood, their hunger sharpening like a blade, and she had prepared. Her fingers were raw and bleeding from digging into the packed earth. The small depression she carved in the corner held a single grim resource: a dead rat she had found during her first night, already stiff and cold when she discovered it by touch. She had hidden it, knowing she might need it not as a meal, but as something else entirely. She tore strips from her dress and wrapped her hands and forearms. Crude protection against teeth she knew could still crush bone. She positioned herself in the center of the cellar where she would not be cornered, and she calmed herself, slow breath after slow breath, until she could feel something settle inside her. Something quiet, something fierce. Above her, footsteps approached. The Baroness, the kennel door creaked open, and the dogs erupted into a frenzy, their barks echoing like thunder in the enclosed space. The Baroness's voice rose to the chaos, sharp and commanding, directing Tybo to unlock the dog runs one by one. Then came the sound Margarite had been bracing for, the scrape of metal, the click of the padlock, and the heavy groan of the trapdoor swinging open. A square of harsh morning light spilled downward, cutting through the dark and striking her eyes like a blow. "All right," the Baroness said coldly. "Let nature prove its rule." The first descent, the first dog appeared in the opening above, massive shape, trembling with hunger and instinct. Bourbon, the largest. He paused at the top of the ladder, sniffing the heavy, stale air of the cellar. Then, to everyone's surprise, he descended with slow, deliberate precision, placing his weight carefully on each rung. When he reached the bottom, he turned toward her. Margarite stood perfectly still, not frozen, not trembling, rooted, present, watching him with eyes that were steady but not challenging. Bourbon's lips lifted slightly, revealing yellowed teeth. His ribs shuddered with each breath. A second dog's claws scraped the ladder. Then a third. Then a fourth. Within moments, all 8 dogs had entered the cellar, their bodies crowding the small space. their hunger saturating the air. Dot from above, the Baroness leaned over the opening, her silhouette sharp against the morning sky. She's not even screaming, Devo murmured, astonished. She will, the Baroness replied. The moment between death and something else. The dogs began to circle her, not in confusion, but in formation. Predators reading prey. Margarite forced herself to inhale, slowly, pulling the scent of them into her lungs. Sweat, old fur, musk, starvation. She did not let her body flinch when Romanoff brushed against her leg, or when Windsor lowered his head as if preparing to spring. Dot, then she took a single step forward. Toward Bourbon, gasps sounded from above. Even the dogs froze. Not prey behavior. Prey ran. Prey begged. Prey screamed. But Margarite stepped forward again, closing the distance between herself and the largest of them. Then she dropped to one knee, bringing her height level with Bourbon's muzzle. Not bowing. Not submitting. Equalizing. She kept her eyes on his, steady but soft. Watching. Not threatening. Slowly, she extended one wrapped hand, not in offering. Not in fear, but in recognition. The cellar held its breath. Bourbon's head tilted. His ears twitched. His snarl faded into something uncertain, dead, very faintly. His tail gave a single, hesitant wag. Breaking the pattern, the Baroness's breath hissed upward through the floorboards. She's gone mad, she snapped. The fear has broken her. But the dogs were not reacting to madness. They were reacting to something deeper than training, something older than commands barked in German. Margarite slid sideways on her knees, moving toward the corner where she'd hidden the dead rat. The dogs followed, their attention hooked now by scent and curiosity instead of bloodlust. With a grim determination, she pulled the rat from the hole. 8 sets of eyes locked onto it, the air itself tightening. She tore the rat in half with both hands, brutal, decisive, and threw one half into a far corner. 4 dogs lunged immediately. Instinct, not training. She hurled the other half in the opposite direction. The remaining dogs scrambled for it. And in those 30 chaotic seconds, something shifted. Something enormous. Something none of the witnesses could explain. When the dogs turned back toward her, they no longer saw prey. They saw the source of food. A member of the pack. A creature who acted with certainty, not fear. And they responded. Grimaldi pressed his muzzle into her shoulder, sniffing deep. Windsor sat beside her, tail sweeping the dirt once. Bourbon lowered his massive head into her hands. When she lifted her arm and slowly, gently scratched behind his ear, the big dog's entire body softened. Above, silence fell. Devo whispered, "This is impossible." Reversal for the next hour, Margarite spoke to them softly. Not commands. Not please. Just sound steady, rhythmic, soothing. The dogs curled around her, forming a living wall of fur and bone. The Baroness shouted commands in German. They ignored her. She threw dried meat down the opening to incite aggression. Bourbon took a strip and carried it to Margarite, dropping it at her feet. The Baroness stared down through the trapdoor, a hand pressed to her mouth. As the dogs, her prized instruments of fear, lay protectively around the girl she meant to kill. By afternoon, the shift was complete. Margarite stood. The dogs rose with her. She moved around the cellar. They followed, not attacking, guarding. By evening, it was clear. The Baroness's control was broken. The dogs had chosen. And they had chosen Margarite. Above, the Baroness's voice trembled with something very close to fear. This isn't possible. This isn't natural. But it didn't matter. In that small buried room, something older than plantation law, louder than cruelty, stronger than fear had taken root. And by nightfall, even the Baroness realized the truth she could not speak. She had locked 8 starving predators in a cellar with someone she believed powerless. But the only creature in that cellar without power was her. By the morning of the second day. The Baroness's perfect punishment had become a humiliation she could no longer ignore. She had expected screams. She had expected chaos, blood, frenzy, the quick violence of 8 starving beasts tearing apart the girl she hated. Instead, silence seeped through the floorboards, unsettling and unnatural. No snarls, no cries. Only the slow, shifting sounds of bodies resting and breathing in tight formation. Tybo, uneasy, checked the trapdoor every few hours. He pressed his ear to the wooden planks and listened. What he reported back was always the same. Movement, low sounds, nothing like feeding, nothing like fighting. The Baroness snapped at him every time, accusing him of incompetence or cowardice. But even she could not mask the tremor in her voice. Something was happening below, and she had no control over it. Inside the cellar. Margarite stayed awake through the long night, her back propped against the wall while the dogs slept around her like a living barricade, their bodies pressed close, sharing warmth, their breaths rising and falling in a rhythm she slowly matched. They were starving. She could feel their ribs beneath her fingers, but the hunger had turned into something else. They were waiting, watching, leaning on her presence as much as she leaned on theirs. By dawn, Margarite understood the nature of the bond forming between them. It wasn't affection, not in any human sense. It was the recognition of another creature caught in the same trap. Shared deprivation had carved away everything unnecessary, every veneer of training, every forced hierarchy. What remained was something raw and unfiltered, survival recognizing survival. Up above, the Baroness paced the length of the kennel, stopping every few minutes to bark commands into the oaken trapdoor. Harsh German words meant to whip the dogs into obedience. But the animals did not respond. They lifted their heads, listened, and then settled back down, indifferent to her voice. For the first time since arriving in Louisiana, the Baroness felt the sting of fear, not of violence, but of irrelevance. Her dogs had always been her proof of power, the living embodiment of her authority. Now they lay silently at the feet of someone she deemed less than human. By midday, her frustration cracked into rage. She ordered Tybo and 5 male house workers to arm themselves with long poles, the kind used to handle dangerous livestock. They gathered in the kennel at her demand, reluctant and pale-faced. Each man understood what she was asking. They were to descend into that cellar, where 8 starving animals waited in the dark, and drag Margarite out by force. But the moment the first man approached the ladder, a low ripple rolled through the cellar, sound so deep it vibrated up through the floorboards. Bourbon rose first, placing himself directly between the ladder and Margarite. His lips peeled back, exposing long teeth, and the other dogs followed his lead, rising in synchronized formation. 8 bodies forming a wall. 8 pairs of eyes glowing with a warning older than language. The man closest to the ladder froze. "Ma'am, I'm not going down there," he said, stepping back. "We'll be torn apart." The Baroness hissed at him to obey, but not even Tybo moved. The overseer had seen enough cruelty to recognize when it was about to be turned against him. In the cellar, Margarite rose slowly. The dogs shifted with her, every movement deliberate. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence alone defined the new order in that cramped space. Nothing frightened the Baroness more than that Dot, driven by humiliation and desperation. Eloise Devo grabbed her pistol and stepped toward the trapdoor. She peered down at Margarite, who stared back without flinching. "Come up," the Baroness commanded. "Now? I will not ask again." Margarite's voice emerged rough from thirst, but steady as iron. "No." The single syllable struck harder than any blow. Eloise staggered back, her breath catching. The overseer and the workers stared, unable to grasp what they had just heard. A slave had refused a direct order. Not with excuses. Not with fear. Simply refused. "You will obey me." The Baroness shrieked, lifting the pistol. "I own you. I own every breath you take." Margarite met her gaze through the opening. "You don't own anything here." "Not anymore." The dogs rumbled in agreement, their bodies tightening like springs. One wrong movement from the Baroness, and they would leap. Even Tybo realized it. He stepped forward quickly and seized the Baroness's arm, lowering the pistol before she doomed them all. "Ma'am, stop," he said urgently. "If you fire that gun, we all die." For the first time, the Baroness looked afraid, not of the dogs, but of the truth she could not escape. She had lost control. Her authority, once absolute, now cracked like thin ice beneath her feet. She stepped back, trembling. "Fine," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Get her out. Just get her out." But Tybo didn't call the men down. Instead, he stepped away from the opening and said the words that would change everything. "Margarite, come up, you and the dogs. No one will touch you." Above and below, every person and animal held their breath. And then Margarite placed her hand on the ladder. Bourbon rose behind her. The others followed. One by one, they ascended not as beasts returning to their mistress, but as a pack rising to daylight behind the girl they had chosen in the dark. And with every rung Margarite climbed, the world the Baroness thought she controlled slipped further and further from her. "Grasp, that you said." Margarite emerged from the trapdoor like someone returning from the underworld filthy. Gaunt, trembling with hunger, yet standing upright with a presence that made even the strongest men in the kennel step back. The morning sunlight struck her face, revealing hollow cheeks and cracked lips. But her eyes, those eyes the Baroness had hated from the first day, were clear. Clearer than they had ever been. But it was not Margarite alone who rose into that light. Bourbon climbed out next, his massive body heaving with starvation, but steady as stone. Then Windsor. Then Grimaldi. Then all 8 dogs, one after another, using the ladder with uncanny coordination. As if they had been practicing for years rather than learning in the dark across 3 desperate days. The moment their paws hit the kennel floor, they did not scatter. They did not run. They formed a circle around Margarite tight, protective, alert, every pair of eyes fixed not on the Baroness, but on anyone who might threaten their newly chosen leader. The workers nearest the door backed away, pressing themselves against the wooden walls. Even Tybo stepped aside, lifting his hands in a gesture of uncertain surrender. The Baroness alone did not move. Her face had gone strangely pale, drained of the fierce color that anger usually brought to her cheeks. She held the pistol at her side, but her fingers trembled. The dogs watched that hand closely, their bodies coiled. "What are you?" the Baroness whispered, her voice thin with disbelief. Margarite turned her head toward her, slow and deliberate. "I am what you tried to destroy," she answered. The room seemed to tilt. A slave speaking with calm authority. 8 trained hunting dogs ignoring every command except hers. The Baroness, for the first time, stood on the wrong side of the power she had thought she controlled. "Do you think this changes anything?" Eloise Devo snapped, trying to gather herself. "You think you have won? I can put you back in chains. I can put every dog back in its run." "I can." "No," Margarite said. "You can't?" The dogs shifted as one, their bodies lowered, ready. The Baroness faltered, stepping back instinctively. The plantation watches by now, the noise had drawn half the estate. Field hands, house servants, and stable boys stood clustered around the entrance of the kennel building, watching with wide, silent eyes. They saw their mistress trembling. They saw her prized animals surrounding a girl she had tried to kill. They saw the unthinkable, a break in the absolute order that governed their world. And the Baroness saw them seeing it. That, more than the dogs, frightened her. "Margarite," Thibault said quietly, stepping forward, palms open. "No one here wants blood. Not theirs. Not yours. The door is open. You can walk out." The Baroness spun on him. "You dare?" But Thibault only shook his head. "Ma'am, you've lost this?" Her jaw clenched with the force of a woman who had never been denied anything in her life. Never contradicted. Never confronted by the consequences of her own cruelty. The walk to freedom, Margarite moved first. She stepped away from the trapdoor, her legs unsteady, but her posture steady as iron. The dogs flowed with her, forming the same protective circle they had held in the cellar. When she walked toward the door of the kennel building, the men gathered there parted without a word. No one, not Tybo, not the field hands. Not the terrified young stable boy closest to the exit, but was willing to test the teeth of 8 starving hounds that had chosen their leader for themselves. The Baroness stood frozen, still holding the useless pistol, as Margarite crossed the threshold. Out into the sunlight. Out into the open yard. Out where everyone in the plantation could see her. There was no hesitation in her steps. Only purpose. Behind her, the dogs fanned out as they stepped into the daylight, their formation adjusting naturally to protect every angle of her body. They looked like guards escorting a queen. The break in power from the doorway, the Baroness watched her property, her slave and her dogs, walking toward the road. "Stop her," she demanded. No one moved. "Stop her," she shrieked, her voice breaking. "She is mine. I own her. Do you hear me? I own her." Even now, in the face of total collapse, she clung to those words like a drowning woman clings to a rope. But the rope was gone. Margarite didn't turn. She simply said, loud enough for all to hear, "You own nothing." The Baroness lifted the pistol with shaking hands. For a long moment, the entire plantation went silent. Then, bang, the shot cracked through the humid morning air. A flock of birds exploded upward from the trees, but Margarite did not fall. The bullet lodged harmlessly in a cypress trunk 20 feet to her right. Whether the Baroness missed or lacked a nerve to aim true, no one ever knew. Thibault lunged, grabbing her arm and wrenching the pistol away before she could fire again. "Ma'am," he shouted, "you shoot her and we all die." "Let her go." The Baroness staggered back, chest heaving, eyes wild. And Margarite, thin, starving, bruised, but upright, kept walking. One step, then another, toward the long road, leading away from the only life she had ever known. The dogs followed in seamless formation. No one dared lift a hand to stop them. The bend in the road near the edge of the estate, where the shell road disappeared into the trees. Margarite paused and looked back one last time. Not at the Baroness. Not at the men. Not at the burning plantation house she had left behind in her future. She looked at the land, the place where she had bent but not broken, where 8 beasts meant to kill her had instead chosen her, where she had been meant to die and instead found her power. Then she turned and continued walking until she and the dogs vanished beyond the bend. Behind her, the Devo estate stood in stunned silence, the shape of a revolution forming in the shadows, even before the first flame would ever touch the house. For the first time in its history, that land had witnessed something impossible. A slave who walked away. Dogs who refused their master. And a mistress who, for once, could not command the world to obey her. The walk toward the shell road marked Margarite's escape. But it also marked the beginning of the end for the Devo estate. When she and the 8 dogs disappeared beyond the tree line, the plantation did not settle back into its routines. It could not. Something had broken, something invisible but unmistakable. The enslaved people felt it first, like the sudden absence of a weight they had carried for so long they no longer noticed its shape. The Baroness retreated into the main house immediately. Her face hollow, her steps stiff as if she were walking in a body that no longer obeyed her. Thibault escorted her inside, but he kept looking back toward the bend in the road, where the last echoes of Margarite's steps had faded. His hand trembled slightly on the doorknob, not from fear of Margarite, but from fear of the truth he had just witnessed inside the house. The Baroness ordered everyone out of her chambers and locked the door. The staff lingered in the hall, listening. They expected shouting. Violent footsteps. Something. But the room stayed quiet eerily so. Hours passed. Noon faded into afternoon. A lunch tray left at the door remained untouched downstairs. Whispers grew like vines. Every enslaved worker and house servant carried the same electric knowledge inside them. The order of things had shifted. They had all seen a girl stand tall in front of the Baroness. They had watched 8 trained beasts choose her over the woman who'd owned them. The moment had been seared into their memories, and no fear or threat could unwrite it by late afternoon. The quiet inside the Baroness's chamber finally broke. But not with her voice. It was smoke. The death of Eloise Devo, a thin trail, drifted into the hallway beneath the door. The cook saw it first. Fire. She screamed, dropping the basket of linens she was carrying. Tybo came running, pounding his fist against the locked door. Baroness, open up. No answer. The smoke thickened. Someone fetched an axe, and 2 field hands broke down the door. Inside, the room was dim and hot, its curtains smoldering, the edges of the bedding beginning to catch flame. The Baroness lay on her bed, fully clothed, hands folded on her chest, as though prepared for burial. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing had stopped, but the strangest detail, the most unsettling, was the teacup, sitting neatly on her bedside table. Half filled with a steep brew the cook recognized. Immediately, foxglove, monkshood, deadly plants she had seen the Baroness cultivating in a private corner of the garden, always claiming they were for medicinal experiments. The parish doctor arrived shortly before sundown. He confirmed the obvious, but wrote something very different. Heart failure, he said. No suspicious circumstances. Everyone in the hallway heard him say it with their own ears. And everyone knew it was a lie. Whether Eloise Devo had killed herself out of humiliation, fear, or the sudden collapse of her sense of control. No one dared record the truth. A plantation mistress dead by her own hand was a stain the parish had no interest in acknowledging. By the time the doctor left, flames had been stamped out in the chamber, leaving only blackened streaks and scorched curtains. But the fire that would consume the estate had already been lit in the hearts of its people. The night of burning 2 nights after the Baroness's death, the estate felt hollow. Without her sharp presence, without her demands, her cruelty, her constant intrusion, the main house seemed less like a seat of authority and more like a carcass waiting to decay. That was when the fires began. They started in 3 different buildings at once. The stables, the storage barn, and the east wing of the main house. The flames moved fast, fueled by the dry timbers and the restless wind. Some said they saw figures slip between the buildings, shadows moving with purpose. Some said they heard prayers muttered in Creole, not for forgiveness, but for cleansing. And others claimed that once the first flame took, no one wanted to stop it. By sunrise, the Devo estate was nothing but smoking skeletons of structures and wet ash where the house had once stood. Neighbors arrived to help control the blaze, but the enslaved people who lived there did not lift a finger to stop it. No one asked why. No one wanted to know. For days after the fire, the people of St. Landry Parish spoke of little else. Even those who had never set foot near the Devo estate felt the story pressing at the edges of their conversations. Like a storm cloud they couldn't keep from drifting overhead. They discussed the fire. They discussed the Baroness's death. But always there. Voices lowered when the subject of the girl and the dogs came up. Some swore they heard the dogs howling in the distance at night, even though no one had seen the animals return. Others claimed a strange silence hung over the swamps, as if the land itself were listening. But the truth was simpler. Margarite had vanished. Completely. No sheriff rode after her. No bloodhounds were released. And no bounty hunters saddled their horses. The Baroness had ordered a pursuit in her final hours, but with her sudden death, no one took up the demand. Her authority evaporated with her last breath, leaving behind a plantation too damaged, too afraid, and too uncertain to bother chasing a ghost. Still, fragments of Margarite's path survived in unexpected places. The northern road several days after her escape. A trader traveling from Alexandria claimed to have seen a girl walking along the river road with a retinue of enormous dogs. He said she moved like someone who had walked a long time without rest, not stumbling or frantic, but steady, like each step belonged exactly where it fell. When he called out to her from his wagon, the lead dog described as a great brown beast with eyes like hot coals turned its head and stared at him with such intensity that he gripped his reins and kept moving without waiting for her reply. 2 days later, a fisherman near the Red River swore he'd seen the same group. They were drinking from a muddy bend in the river. Margarite had knelt with cupped hands, pouring water slowly onto the tongue of one dog too weak to lap it up himself. The fisherman said something about her presence held him still, as if the world's noise dulled for a moment. And I were not supposed to interfere. When he blinked, they were gone into the trees. These sightings were never written in official ledgers, but they appeared in letters, private words not meant for the public eye. Those letters would one day end up in dusty archival boxes, connecting dots across miles of Louisiana wilderness. Each described the same strange procession. A girl thin as hunger and fierce as hunger's refusal, and 8 beasts moving with her like shadows that had learned to breathe. The dog's transformation as Margarite traveled north. The dogs began to change. They were still starving when they left the estate. Their ribs jutted like bent rails under their fur, and their steps were shaky, unsteady. But in the days that followed, something remarkable occurred. Their gauntness gave way to strength. Each night, Margarite scavenged for food along the roadside and in the forest. Nuts, river mussels, roots she recognized from her childhood in Virginia, anything that could be eaten. She gathered and shared. Dot always shared. If she found only enough for one dog, she fed that dog and went hungry herself. If she found enough for 3, she fed those 3 first. She let the dogs watch her do it, watch the order of her actions. Their survival before hers. Dot in a world where every hierarchy had been built upon domination. The dogs learned a new one rooted in care, not force. And because they were creatures of instinct, of simple cause and effect, they came to understand this girl was now the center of their world, the provider, the protector. Their pack got their hackles no longer rose at rustling leaves. Their movements sharpened, becoming synchronized. By the 6th day, hunters who glimpsed them from afar mistook the animals for wolves, silent, watchful, working as one. But wolves are born of blood ties. These bonds were forged in starvation, fear, and the shared defiance of a woman who refused to die. A place to rest for a moment on the 8th day of her journey. Margarite reached a small abandoned hunter's hut tucked into a stand of pines near the border of Landry Parish. It was barely more than a shack with a sagging roof and a rusted stove, but to a girl who had slept on packed earth for most of her life, it was shelter. She stayed there through the night, gathering strength. The dogs lay around her in a broad ring, their bodies pressed close to stay warm. For the first time since the cellar, she slept deeply, her breath slow and even beneath the weight of exhausted safety. Morning came with bird calls and the scent of wet grass. Margarite rose, fed the dogs what little she'd found, 2 squirrels and a handful of persimmons, and then turned north once more. She left the hut behind without looking back. What the parish chose not to sing Opelousas. The aftermath of the fire swallowed the Devo estate's secrets. Officials recorded only the neat, bloodless version of events. Accidental fire. Mistress deceased. Property sold. No mention of the cellar. No mention of the dogs. No mention of the runaway girl who walked off the land surrounded by creatures trained to kill her. Those details lived only in the memories of the people, who had been their people whose voices rarely reached the parish books. And perhaps that was why the parish breathed easier as the story faded. Because if Margarite's escape became known, beyond whispers and letters, it would threaten the entire system built on the belief that slaves could be broken. So the officials did what frightened people always do when faced with a truth too large to hold. They buried it, but stories like Margarite's do not stay buried. Not when witnessed by so many eyes. Not when written in letters that traveled up and down the Mississippi. Not when whispered in the dark by people who had always understood the power of a lived story. A legend in the making by midsummer. The tale had already begun to change. Some said the girl had walked all the way to Natchez. Some said she crossed into Arkansas's territory. Some said she boarded a boat heading for the free states upriver. Some said, whispered, really that she had not been entirely human when she left the cellar. But all who spoke of her, whether in fear or reverence, agreed she had not walked alone. Wherever she went, 8 silent shadows followed, not pursuing, not guarding, but belonging. And As her story passed from plantation to plantation, across fireside nights and whispered gatherings, a new idea began to flicker beneath the surface. Of every telling, if one girl could survive the impossible, if one girl could command what was meant to destroy her, if one girl could walk away from Louisiana's cruelty with her head held high, then what else might be possible? Be enslaved. Heard that question and tucked it quietly into their hearts. The masters heard it and slept less easily than before, and Margarite, wherever she was, walked farther still. The road opening before her like a promise only she believed she could claim. The girl who had refused to break had slipped out of the world that tried to crush her. And nothing records, authorities, or fear could bring her back. In the months that followed Margarite's disappearance, St. Landry Parish settled into a strange, uneasy quiet. It was not peace implies resolution. Well, however, the countryside was closer to a collective holding of breath, as if the land itself waited for something that hadn't yet arrived. The Devo estate was gone, burned until only ashes and twisted iron hinges remained. Grass grew quickly over the blackened soil, softening the outlines of what had once been buildings, erasing the paths where overseers had walked and dogs had patrolled. Nature, indifferent to human tragedy, reclaimed the ground with startling speed, but the people, both enslaved and free, did not move on so easily. The story of what happened haunted them in different ways. For the enslaved, it became a symbol, whispered at night, a girl who refused to break, and beasts who refused their master. For the white planters, it became something far more unsettling, crack in the foundation of the world they relied on to stay upright. The parish's official amnesia, the parish magistrates held a brief meeting to address the matters left behind by Eloise Devo's death. They reviewed her will, poorly written, full of vague bequests, and quickly decided that the estate's debt outweighed any loyalty owed to her memory. The fire was recorded as accidental. Her death, still listed as heart failure, was mentioned only to finalize the transfer of property. No one brought up Margarite. No one mentioned the dogs. No one acknowledged the growing rumors circulating along the river roads. It was as if the incident had been swallowed whole by a bureaucratic mouth that chewed the truth into tasteless scraps and swallowed them without a trace. In polite company, the Baroness became a cautionary tale of eccentricity and fragile nerves. The fire was painted as a tragic accident. The Devo name was quietly folded into the past, easier to forget than to examine. But the enslaved workers of the neighboring plantations remembered everything. They spoke of it in fragments, coded phrases, and sideways references, always careful who might overhear. The story carried too much danger to be spoken plainly, but too much power to be silenced. 3 freed people and a quiet debt, the manumission papers were Baptiste. Marie-Louise and Thomas were filed without ceremony or explanation. The clerks processing them shrugged. Such things happened when estates broke apart. But among the enslaved community, these acts of freedom rippled with significance. Some said these 3 had earned their liberty through courage in those final days. Some said they helped start the fire. Some said they knew exactly what killed the Baroness and had kept that secret locked behind their teeth, whatever they carried. They carried it quietly. They did not speak of the cellar, or the dogs, or the girl who walked away. Freedom, in their hands, was a fragile gift, easily broken by too much truth. The land becomes legend, that as summer deepened, wild vines crawled over the ruins of the Devo estate. By autumn, even the stone steps of the main house had disappeared beneath creeping moss. Travelers passing along the shell road sometimes stopped to stare at the blackened earth, feeling unsettled without knowing why. A few claimed to hear faint barking at dusk, though no dogs lived in the area anymore. Children dared each other to approach the ruin. Field hands carried offerings of tobacco or corn and left them at the edge of the burned property, not out of fear, but respect, as though honoring an unspoken covenant formed in the ashes. The Devo land was sold off and divided among 3 buyers, but none rebuilt the main house. They preferred to farm the outer fields, leaving the central grounds untouched. No one said it aloud, but every man who walked those boundaries felt something watching, a reminder that the land had a memory. and some memories resisted plowing under. A story that walked by itself in notches. A riverboat gambler told of a girl seen walking north with a pack of enormous dogs at her heels. In Vicksburg, a preacher claimed he'd heard about a young woman who escaped bondage under miraculous protection. In Arkansas, a mother told her children not to wander into the woods at night, for there walks the girl whose spirit calls the beasts. The stories traveled farther than Margarite herself, if indeed she still lived. Some said she crossed into the Free States. Some said she settled with the tribes along the Arkansas River. Some said she married, lived quietly, and kept 8 old hounds until the last of them died at her feet. Others whispered darker things, that she became a guide for runaways, appearing in the woods when someone was desperate enough to need her. Dogs prowling at her side like shadows given flesh, that she could slip past patrols unseen. Her presence felt only in the way night suddenly quieted, truth and myth braided together until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. The story Mississippi. Would not forget in the 1930s. When the Federal Writers Project interviewed elderly former slaves across the South, an interesting pattern emerged. In Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas, scattered among dozens of unrelated interviews, a story appeared again and again, always altered, always shaped by memory and time, but always recognizable. They called it the girl and the dogs. Some made her older, some younger. Some placed her in different parishes or different years. Some said she rode a horse. Others said she walked barefoot. Some claimed the dogs were spirits. Others insisted they were flesh and blood. But the core of the story never changed. A girl meant to be broken was locked in a place meant to destroy her. Instead, she emerged with the loyalty of the very beasts trained to kill her. She walked away from bondage, and no one dared stop her. A story like that endured not because it was comfortable, but because it challenged the world's harshest assumptions, because it offered a glimpse of a truth so powerful it frightened those who benefited from silence. The aftermath that couldn't be erased, though. The Devo estate's ruins faded into wild growth, and parish officials tried to forget the incident. The people closest to its cruelty could not. Something had changed after Margarite walked away, something subtle but undeniable. The enslaved began to move differently on nearby plantations. Their eyes lifted more often. Their shoulders bent a little less. Overseers noticed that fear, once so reliable, didn't work quite the same anymore. No rebellion came. No uprising. But a seed had been planted, carried through whisper networks stronger than chains. 1 girl, 8 dogs. And a story that refused to die. And though Margarite herself vanished into the river roads and pine forests of the South, her impact lingered like the last traces of smoke after a fire. Not seen, not named, but unmistakably present. A reminder that even in the darkest cellar, where death waits with open jaws, a human being with unbroken will can rewrite fate, even if the world tries to bury her for it.